Who's ready for a sauerkraut lesson? Sauerkraut is actually way easier than people think. All we need is a bit of cabbage, a bit of salt, a knife, a cutting board, and a bowl to start with, and then of course some jars to package them all into. Sauerkraut. I like to mix things up a little bit, and I like to make my sauerkraut pink, because you do. So this is my sauerkraut here, and no, that's not purple cabbage. I'm going to tell you about that in a minute, but I like the look of it a lot more. It looks pretty on my plate. I like to have lots of color on my plate, so it's just an extra color that I can add to my plate, and also extra antioxidants, because what I have used is a small bunch of beetroot. That's all it is. I've just grated in some beetroot and added it to the sauerkraut mix. You could also use something like caraway seeds. You could use dill. You could pretty much use anything your little heart desires to flavor your sauerkraut. But what I do recommend is that you make one simple sauerkraut first up before you start experimenting. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I've only got a small cabbage today because I actually have about 6 months worth of sauerkraut put away at the moment. I've got a big fermenting crock and I make up about 10 litres at a time. So this one's just for you guys today. So I'm just going to cut up my cabbage finely. I'm going to get rid of that one just because it's got that big vein in it. So you can cut it up as fine or as rough as you like. But when you're doing sauerkraut by hand and you're not using a crock, it can be easier to have it just that little bit finer. Okay, so it's all chopped up. It's not perfect. I'm not about perfect, it's just not who I am. So you can see there's some thick bits, there's some fine bits. It really doesn't matter. But what matters now is how much salt we put on it. Okay, so we're going to get this into the bowl. The reason that salt is important is, well, there's two reasons. One reason is that salt is going to help to drag out all of the natural liquids that are locked up inside the cells of the cabbage. And it's the liquid that you want your cabbage covered by in your jar to keep the air out. So I'm going to get rid of that. The other reason that we use salt is to protect the culture until it begins to ferment and create its own lactic acid. Now, lactic acid is a little bit like vinegar. So you see those fake sauerkrauts where they use vinegar, and the vinegar protects the cabbage from pathogenic microbes like molds and bacteria that aren't good for you. But in this case, we're going to utilize a more traditional technique, and we're going to use salt to protect that culture until such times as it is able to start to form its own lactic acid and protect itself. It will still have that tart, and I say in inverted commas, vinegary taste of sauerkraut. And in fact, it tastes so much better than the commercial sauerkraut that you can buy in the supermarkets. Okay, let's talk measurements, because it is important, but I'm also going to be really honest here and say that I'm terrible at measuring things. I was taught to cook by my grandmother, and her instructions to me were, as I was very small and growing up beside her cooking, were just throw in this much of that and that much and that, you know, just get a feel for it, throw in a handful of that. And that is how I tend to cook, which isn't really helpful for other people, and I do like to teach, so I'm trying to convert measurements for you. What I will say is that traditionally, if you go into, I don't know, Google or a book, what it will say is that it's approximately 1 teaspoon of salt per 500 grams of cabbage when you're doing small batches, so that's just doing it into jars, or it's 4 tablespoons of salt to 6 kilos of cabbage if you're doing it in a sauerkraut crock. I can honestly tell you now that I am going to use more than 1 teaspoon per 500 grams here right now. I'm a little bit partial to salt. If you've seen my other videos, you'll know that. I am adrenal, but I also don't like wasting cabbage. And I sometimes find that when I use less salt, molds get in. It's not protecting it enough. And I find to go a little bit saltier at the start, by the time it's fermented, you don't really taste that salt. If it's fermented properly, you won't taste that salt that much. I do like salt. So what I'm going to do here today, what I've got is about 800 grams of cabbage, which by rights should be about 1.5 teaspoons of salt. So I'm going to put in how much I think. So we're going to sprinkle it over the top. That is nowhere near enough as far as I'm concerned. That's 2. Let me just give that a little toss. So we're going to toss it through now to get all of the cabbage coated and get that liquid starting to pull out from the inside of the cabbage cells. And I can just feel it's just not enough. So I'm going to put on another teaspoon and toss again. And of course, after a little bit of practice, you will work this out for yourself, and it'll go by how successful your batch has been, what it tasted like, what flavors you prefer, whether you like a little bit of salt or not. And I'm actually just going to go 1/2 teaspoon more. So I think we're up to 3.5 teaspoons. And that feels better already. I can already feel the liquid starting to come out. I can feel that each bit of cabbage has salt covering it, and that's the way I like it. So I'm going to take this tea towel and I'm just going to cover it up so the flies don't get in it. And while I've got you here, we're just going to talk a little bit about salt, because salt is not just salt. What I don't want you using is table salt. Table salt is nothing but sodium chloride, and real salt is so much more than that. I use a Celtic sea salt. I have used Himalayan salt and I have absolutely no problem with Himalayan salt. However, I find that when I am fermenting, the Himalayan salt just isn't quite salty enough to protect my culture. I have lost a couple of batches using Himalayan salt, and I do have to use a whole lot more than I would normally use. So for me, Celtic sea salt is really very, very salty, and I find it's much better at protecting my culture. The other thing that I just wanted to say as far as measurements are concerned is that if you're going to use beetroot, that small bunch of beetroot that I showed you, I use a small bunch of beetroot in about 8 to 10 litres of sauerkraut. So in a small batch like this, you probably only need 1 small beetroot bulb and you'd get a nice pink colour. Caraway seeds, do them to taste, experiment with what you like. I once had my 2-year-old dump a whole packet of caraway seeds into the sauerkraut crock. It tasted very much like caraway, but it was still delicious. So once you've done a simple sauerkraut, from there start to experiment with your flavors. So we're going to come back in probably 2 or 3 hours and just see how that cabbage is going. Has it softened? Have we pulled out lots of liquid? And then we're going to start actually helping it a little bit. Okay, so the cabbage, well, the salted cabbage has been sitting for a couple of hours now, and that salt's really starting to draw out the liquids from the cabbage cells. So we're going to take this a step further. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to hold this up and hopefully you can see this. Can you see that liquid sitting in the bottom there? That's all come out of the cabbage. I haven't actually added any liquid to that at all, and I'm hoping not to have to add any. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to help that breakdown process a little bit. When I use my crock, it sits quite high. It's a big crock, and I use a big wooden rolling pin to gently and not so gently bash the cabbage and help break up those cells and release the liquids. I've just found my daughter's toy one that she uses, and I'm going to steal it for today. to do this one. So we're just giving it a little bash. You don't want to bash too hard because you don't want to split the bowl. Just giving it a little bash, helping to break up the cells of the cabbage and release even more liquids. I've been bashing this for a couple of minutes now, and while I've been bashing it, I've been looking at it thinking, this looks so boring. I can't help myself. I don't think I ever do a recipe that doesn't have a bit of me in it. I tend to change everything. And I just remembered that I had some beautiful fresh dill in the fridge. So I'm going to add a little bit of this in because I just can't help myself. I just need a bit more color. I just find the plain sauerkraut really boring. Sorry if you find it delicious. I just find it boring. So I'm just going to add in some of this fresh dill, which I might add smells absolutely divine. Love the smell of dill. For some reason it just reminds me of salmon, probably because they go together. Just adding a bit more in here, and then I'll start to bash that in as well. And you can see I'm being really precise about the way I do this. Doesn't matter. All right, I'm going to keep bashing for a little while longer. Been bashing this for a while now, and I have to say, the dill is making me really excited. It smells absolutely amazing, and it's taken what I think is a fairly boring sauerkraut and turned it into something that I desperately want to eat. So I'm actually a little disappointed now that I've got to wait a few weeks. But after all that bashing, what I've noticed is that I'm actually not getting any more liquid out of it. So it's possible that this cabbage is just a little bit dry, and that happens. Sometimes it happens with storage. The cabbages will lose some of their liquid, but sometimes it's also a reflection of the growing conditions as well. It may have just been a drier season for the cabbages and they're not holding as much liquid. The last lot I did, the 10-litre lot that I was telling you about, had so much liquid that it actually overflowed my crock. It was amazing. But this one's just a little bit drier. So what I'm going to have to do is actually add a little bit of a brine to the jar. So our brine, what you need, and it depends on how much you need, of course, too. So I only need possibly a cup and maybe less, I think. I could have that wrong, but that's what I'm thinking. So I'm going to use one heaped dessert spoon in 250 mils of water. Other measurements I've seen is 1.5 tablespoons in 1 litre of water. You do need to be a little bit careful with it. I don't like using a brine. I much prefer to use the cabbage's natural juices, but it's just not there this time. And although that's annoying, it's actually really great for this video because you get to see that this does happen. It's not you, it is the cabbage, and it will need a brine. So I'm going to start packing this into a jar and work out exactly how much brine I need. Got my cabbage in the jar. I have tamped it down with the rolling pin, and you'll see that the liquid is starting to come up the sides of the cabbage, but it's not enough. It really needs to come a good inch over the top of that cabbage and possibly more. So I am going to have to add the brine. Now, when you make a brine, please do not use tap water. Tap water is chlorinated The chlorine will kill the natural good bacteria in your culture. You need to use either filtered water or spring water. So I've got about 250 mils of water here. I'm going to add a heaped dessert spoon, or in this case a soup spoon, because I couldn't find a dessert spoon. That's how I roll. I'm going to pop it in here. I'm just going to give it a little mix. It doesn't have to be completely dissolved. It has plenty of time to dissolve in the jar. But we just want to get it mixed in enough that when I pour it into the jar, we don't have all the salt sitting in the bottom. Okay, I'm going to pour that into here. And I have used most of that. I'm just going to give this another tamp and see where that cabbage is sitting now. Don't worry too much about the floaty bits. Floaty bits happen. You can start picking them off all you like. 5 minutes later, there will be more floaty bits. There's quite a bit of salt in there, so they should be protected from going moldy. I'm just going to lift out that little bit of cabbage there, and this one's sitting on the inside of the jar that's out of the liquid. Okay, I'll put the lid on it. We'll talk about the lids in a minute. Okay, so I'm going to have to move my camera so that you can see the level of the brine. Right, so you can see that I've put the lid on there securely. When you use a sauerkraut crock, the lid's not secure, but it is sealed. So what we do is we put the lid into a well, and then we fill the well with water. That stops the oxygen getting in, but allows the gas, the carbon dioxide gas, to release as it needs to. So as it starts to build up in there, instead of smashing my crock or exploding, it's gradually releasing off bubbles of carbon dioxide gas, and you can hear that blipping. It's one of the happiest sounds in the world, I think. But with a jar, that's not going to happen. So you have to be really careful that you're not going to explode your jar. So it's a really good idea to wrap your bottle up in a towel. We want to keep the light out because microbes love light, like bad microbes. So we'll keep it in a cool place, 18 to 22 degrees. But what we're going to do is we're going to check it daily, and we're going to burp the bottle. So we'll just slightly release off the bottle, let any gases out, and quickly do it back up again. You don't need to take the lid right off, just let the gas out, turn the lid back on again, cover it up with your towel again, and put it back in its nice cool place. And this is going to ensure that we don't get an explosive buildup of gases. You want some carbon dioxide in there because that carbon dioxide will also help to protect your culture from pathogenic microbes, but we don't want so much in there that it's dangerous. So that is how you make sauerkraut. You're now going to leave that in a dark, cool spot for about 2 to 4 weeks. You can taste it at the 1 week mark. You can taste it at the 2 week mark. That's no problem at all. Whip a bit out, see if it's yummy, see if it's as fermented as you like it to be. But generally speaking, using this method, we're talking at least 2 to 4 weeks, and sometimes a little bit longer, depending on what the climate is at the time. Cooler weather, things will take longer to ferment to completion than in warmer weather. But I do find that even though it takes longer to ferment, I prefer the deeper and more complex flavor of a sauerkraut that's made slowly during the winter. So it's up to you how you do it. If you want it done quickly, do it in warmer weather. If you want it done more slowly and with better flavors, do it in the winter. So that's it. There's your sauerkraut. It should be ready in about 2 to 4 weeks, but don't forget to burp your bottles regularly.